Within phylum Ascomycota, the fruiting bodies are referred to as an ascocarp. Now, if we have some knowledge about the phylum Basidiomycota, we can think that, okay, the phylum Basidiomycota has fruiting bodies that are known as basidiocarps. So we can make that relationship with the phylum Ascomycota, in which the fruiting bodies in phylum Ascomycota are going to be referred to as ascocarps. And these ascocarps, or these fruiting bodies within phylum Ascomycota, will have different morphologies. Now here we have the main types of morphologies seen in the Ascomycota ascocarps. We start off with the apothecium. Now the apothecium is this open, kind of bowl-shaped like structure in which this area shaded in purple is referred to as the stroma. Now remember that the stroma is essentially hyphal tissue that is super compactly aggregated, and we get this thick structure which we call the stroma. And the stroma in ascocarps is mainly haploid. And above the stroma we can actually see, I'll spell this out so we have an understanding. So this, in purple, we have the stroma. Now over here up top, we have these structures. We have these orange structures and we have these blue structures. Now what are these called? Well, the one in orange, they actually have something inside. So these orange structures are known as the ascus or the asci. So over here, this orange structure is an asci, or it can be also called an ascus. Now within the asci, these smaller circular structures are referred to as ascospores. So the ascospores are what are the spores that are going to be released into the environment. Now the blue structure is actually a structure that is used in the support of the ascocarp and the ascus, and that structure is known as the periphysis. So if we spell this out, this is the periphysis. And that's the structure of the apothecium. Essentially, it's this open kind of dome bowl-shaped structure, and within it we see the asci and we see the periphyses. The asci contain the ascospores, which are going to be released into the environment. Another important concept about these asci is that each ascus will typically hold about 8 ascospores. Now in this diagram, it's hard to fit in 8 ascospores, but in reality, we do have 8. And then that's essentially the apothecium, the stroma, the periphyses, the asci, and the ascus spores. Next we have the perithecium, and the perithecium, it can have the same structures as the apothecium. So it'll have the asci, it can have the periphyses, it still has the stroma, but the shape is different. The perithecium has this flask-like shape instead of this open bowl-like shape. Now, another thing I want to mention is that the periphyses do not have to be present in all apothecia. The periphyses may or may not be present, and that is dependent on which type of fungi we are talking about. Not all ascomycotan fungi will have periphyses. It just depends on the fungi. So the perithecium is essentially the same. It just differs in shape, and we'll notice that all of these different types of ascocarp morphology can have periphyses, have an ascus, have ascospores, and a stroma, but they differ in shape. So the perithecium has this flask-like shape, and then we have the Cleistothecium. So the Cleistothecium and the gymnothecium are relatively similar, in which we have the ascus and the ascospore enclosed within the stroma completely. And when we have something enclosed completely within, this can also be referred to as the Perithecium. So I can spell that out. So this can also be referred to as the Perithecium. Perithecium is essentially when the stroma completely encloses everything inside. So these structures on the inside, they're still the ascus, and within the ascus we have the ascospores. Now, the only difference between the gymnothecium and the Cleistothecium is that the Cleistothecium is more organized, where the gymnothecium is less organized. We can see the disorganization. Everything isn't completely in one general area. It's kind of dispersed all around. Next, we have the Chasmothecium. And the Chasmothecium is essentially, it kind of looks like a nut, a peanut of some sort that's like broken in half. That's how we can kind of think about it. So it's like cracked open, and when it cracks open, it exposes the asci and the ascospores within the asci. And what's interesting is that a Chasmothecium can actually be a apothecium that cracks open. So moving on, we also have a Pseudothecium. A Pseudothecium actually looks quite similar to a Perithecium, but we can see the distinct difference in that a Perithecium is relatively quite similar to a flask shape, whereas a Pseudothecium has more of a circular shape, and it still has the ascus and the ascospores. And then next we have the Osteothecium. Now, within the Osteothecium, it essentially just means that we have this single opening at the top and everything else is completely enclosed by the stroma. And within the Osteothecium, we have two subcategories. We have the Thyreothecium and we have the Catathecium. The only difference between the two is that whether stroma exists on the bottom. So over here in the Thyreothecium, we can see that there's no stroma on the bottom, but in the Catathecium, we do have that stroma going all around. And it's kind of like a squished Perithecium, where it's squished down, it kind of still has that flask shape, but since it's been squished, it's lost that flask shape character. Over here, we're actually missing the ascospores on the inside. And that is essentially the different types of Ascocarp morphology. So once again, I'm going to reiterate that the paraphyses, which are present for structural support, can be present in any type of Ascocarp. It all just depends on which fungi we're talking about. Some fungi may have it, but some may not. And the Ascocarp so depending on which fungi we're talking about, it'll have a different morphology, and its morphology of the fruiting body, also known as the Ascocarp, can be an apothecium, a perithecium, Cleistothecium. It can be a gymnothecium, Chasmothecium, Pseudothecium, or an Osteothecium. And that is essentially our Ascocarp morphology.